Section G, Truman, the gutty man from Missouri. So gutty meaning having a lot of guts. All right, so Truman is considered to be the accidental president, at least his opponents called him that. Of course, he was VP under FDR during FDR's fourth term, so we'll see Truman really kind of bringing America through the last little bit of World War II. So the background for Truman, he did not have a college degree, no college education. He served in France during World War I. He kind of risen through the ranks in Missouri politics. He became a senator kind of as the fruit of a political machine out of Kansas City. So really kind of an average Joe, not a splendid background. He wasn't a governor of a big, state, nothing like that. But nonetheless, when he became president, he really inherited just a staggering amount of problems. But he evolved into leadership. He gained confidence, even to the point of being cocky. And he really had the feeling like he always had to prove himself. So even if he had made a mistake, his personality, he was not willing to concede to that mistake. He didn't want to seem indecisive. He didn't want to seem weak. So if he made a mistake, he would just, that's what I meant to do, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that's that sort of thing. A lot of moxie, but a lot of courage, no pretension, very honest, what you see is what you got, that sort of thing. And he even had a little sign on his desk at the Oval Office that says, "The buck stops here." So have you ever heard the phrase like passing the buck, kind of meaning passing off the responsibility? Well, that stopped there, okay? Just because we're learning history right now, passing the buck, the history behind that phrase. So back in the frontier era, kind of like the Western frontier cowboys, that sort of thing, when they'd be playing poker, you take turns being the dealer when you're playing poker. And what they would do to kind of mark who's dealing, that sort of thing, is they'd usually put a marker on the table, that sort of thing, to remind themselves who was the dealer. This is a long story, but who cares? And a lot of times that marker would be like a buckhorn knife, so it's called the buck. So if you didn't want to deal, you could pass the buck or that responsibility on. So passing the buck stops here, Truman. You don't need to know any of that. Anyway, Section H, Yalta, bargain or betrayal. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so Yalta is a World War II conference, and this is kind of going to throw you off because now we're going to backtrack a little bit into the end of World War II and looking at the politics of it. So just to remind you, some of the conferences we have seen during World War II, we had the Tehran Conference, and that was the first meeting of the Big Three, and that's when they're planning Operation Overlord, which was, D-Day invasion, so that was kind of the first meeting of the Big Three. And next we'll see Yalta, which we'll talk about now, and then after Yalta is Potsdam, which we already talked about, so I'm just saying we're going out of order a little bit. Nonetheless, let's talk about Yalta, shall we? So Yalta, this was actually still FDR. This is not Truman yet. And what it's doing is trying to figure out, what to do with Germany, with Asia, with Eastern Europe after the war. So kind of making a game plan for after the war. Yes. And what they decided to do at Yalta, I'm not even saying it right, but whatever, is they're going to divide Germany into different occupation zones. So there's going to be 4 different kind of areas in Germany, each area under a different allied power. Also, they decided that places like Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania, they would have their own government based on free elections. We'll see Russia kind of forget about that deal after the war. So we're just going to pause here to talk about Russia versus USSR. Okay, when do you call it Russia? When do you call it the USSR? Okay, So the USSR, that literally stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So the idea is Russia has always been, Russia will always be, okay? So what happened after the Russian Revolution during World War I, the Bolsheviks took control. The Bolsheviks are communist, right? When that happened, a couple years after that, that's when we see the birth of the USSR. And that was in 1922, if you care to know. So the USSR has always included Russia. But the USSR is a bigger term. It encompasses more things. So the USSR would include, I think, like Bulgaria and some of these other kind of states. So the USSR is including Russia, but actually has more than Russia, okay? And we'll see the USSR actually go away in 1991. So Russia was always a part of the USSR. So kind of during this time, we'll call it USSR, we'll call it Russia. It really means the same thing, okay? It's just the USSR is a more inclusive term than Russia. So you know, I'm just off track here. Okay. So also at Yalta, besides divvying out Germany, they decide that they want to create kind of a new and improved League of Nations, kind of an international peacekeeping organization. And this is when we see the development of the United Nations, or the UN. So the League of Nations had more or less died at the beginning of World War II. And so now we're seeing a new creation, and this is the UN. Okay, so we'll talk about the UN a little bit later. But also a part of Yalta, they really wanted to make sure that Russia would join in the Pacific theater, or like the Japanese front, once Germany was defeated. Because the idea was that we were looking at an invasion of Japan still. This is before we knew for certain we were going to use atomic bomb. So because we were thinking of a full-on invasion of Japan, we really, really wanted to make sure that Russia would join in on that invasion of Japan, because up to this point, Russia had not declared war on Japan. Russia was more concerned with the Nazis. You know, that was kind of a big deal for Russia. So Yalta, we really want to make sure that Russia is going to enter the war and help us defeat Japan. Okay, and we kind of make a deal with Russia. So we say, Russia, 3 months after the defeat of Germany, then you'll enter the war. And in exchange for you entering the war, you know, on our side against Japan, we gave them a number of concessions. We gave them some islands that used to be owned by Japan. And also we promised to give them a lot more control over China, specifically Manchuria. You know, everyone likes Manchuria. Anyways, give them more control of the railroads there, and also give them a couple key seaports that help them really have economic hold really on China. So we kind of gave them China, so to speak, in exchange for helping us beat Japan, because we were still thinking we might just do that full-on invasion of Japan, which never happened because of the atomic bombs. So some people really criticized FDR, saying you really kind of sold China to Russia very inexpensively, especially because we dropped the bombs and Russia wasn't really, Russia, I think, was in the war for a whole 2 days, right? Because they entered the war almost, I think it was the day before we dropped the first bomb. But nonetheless, yeah, so the leader of China at this time was Chiang Kai-shek, okay? Chiang Kai-shek was, he was a nationalist, you could say. He was not communist, okay? This is before China was communist. But a lot of people will blame Yalta for the communist overthrow of Chiang Kai-shek's government just 4 years later. So a lot of people in China really kind of distrusted Chiang Kai-shek, was really mad at the United States, the capitalist United States, for kind of selling them out to Russia at the Yalta Conference. So that kind of civil unrest will kind of eventually lead to the communist overthrowing Chiang Kai-shek in about 4 years. And we'll see I can't even talk. We'll see the nationalist leader kind of going into exile in Taiwan. So today, Taiwan, the little island off the east coast of China, it's kind of like a capitalist, I can't even say it, capitalist bubble within the fuller China, which is communists. we're just going to keep going. Okay, hopefully that made sense. If not, it was details you probably don't need to know anyway. Okay, let's go on. Yalta, see you later. Okay, section I, the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay, so the US and the SU, the Soviet Union, very suspicious of one another. The US was, the capitalist powerhouse, and the Soviet Union was the communist powerhouse at the time. And there was a lot of distrust. Kind of our history had never been golden. I mean, we refused to recognize the communist government in Russia for its first 16 years of existence, right? That's not exactly, a love affair there. And also, the Soviet Union was skeptical of the US and Britain, because for a long time we had promised to open that second front, but it took us almost a year longer than we promised to open up that second front, so there's definitely some bad feelings there. Also, we left the Soviet Union out of the Manhattan Project. We kept them out of the loop when we were developing the atomic weapons. We were working with Britain, we were communicating with Churchill in the United States, but we'd kind of left Russia out of the party, so to speak, when it came to atomic weapons until the very end. So there's some distrust there. And also something we did is the Soviet Union asked the United States after the war for $6 billion to help rebuild the nation, and the United States refused to give them that money. On the same hand, we did give money to Britain, but we said no to the Soviet Union. Once again, some hard feelings there. And then, frankly, we just had completely different ideas of what we wanted to look, what we wanted the post-war Europe to look like. Russia, the Soviet Union, the USSR, whatever you want to call it, really wanted to create a buffer zone on its western border, because they were invaded during World War I, they were invaded during World War II, so they really wanted to kind of create this buffer zone between themselves and the rest of Europe. Okay. On the other hand, the United States always wants people to have their own nations, their own countries. We don't like imperialism. So the United States, in their mind, that's horrible. We don't want you to have these kind of buffer states under your wing. We want them all to have their independence, that sort of thing. So our philosophies were just very different on what we wanted Europe to look like. Okay. And, we really did parallel each other, like parallel lines, right? Never crossing, always different. Parallel lines, for example, both the United States and the Soviet Union before the war were very isolationists, okay? The US by choice, the Soviet Union not by choice. They'd kind of been not invited to the European party after World War I. And also, both of our governments had come to power through revolutions, right? The American Revolution took power away from the British control, and then the Bolshevik Revolution during World War I, giving the communists power, that revolution. So we both gained our power through revolution, and we both really wanted to spread our economic and political ideologies throughout the world, right? The United States wanted everyone to be a capitalist democracy, and, the Soviet Union wanted communism to spread. So we were really kind of two sides of the same coin in that regards, kind of like complete opposites. And yay, even the US and the SU, mind blown. Anyway, okay, let's see, is there anything else to say? Oh, the Cold War. So just in case you didn't catch it, this is what the Cold War is. Cold War is this kind of tense standoff starting after World War II. It'll last till the late 80s, so it's like 45 years of conflict that really overshadows the whole post-war world. We'll see kind of flare-ups of the Cold War here and there, but not direct bombing of each other, so to speak. Okay, section J, shaping the post-war world. All right, so Bretton Woods Conference is held in 1944 in New Hampshire, so we're still in World War II still. I told you we're backtracking, so we're still in World War II. And what this does is this conference really kind of, it's kind of like, let's all get along, let's work together. So we develop a lot of different like programs that'll benefit everybody. Okay, so for example, this Bretton Woods Conference creates the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, to help encourage trade and regulate currency exchange rates. They set up the World Bank, that'll help really International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, kind of giving loans that'll help rebuild Europe. And the United States took lead in a lot of these international bodies. We fund a lot of these programs that are coming out of this conference. And because of that, the Soviet Union refuses to participate. Okay, so on April 25th of 1945, the United Nations actually adjourns. They begin. I think adjourn means begin. Maybe it means close. I don't know. The United Nations, what we had wanted since Yalta, that actually comes into fruition. And we're really starting it before the war ends to really capitalize on the spirit of cooperation that was definitely felt during the war. So we thought, unlike the League of Nations that happened after World War I, we're going to start the United Nations during the end of World War II to really help, hopefully, that cohesion last a little bit longer after the war. Okay, so the United Nations, still around today, its headquarters is in New York City. And what it is assembly of different nations. I think there's 193 nations represented in the UN. And there's kind of two groups. Kind of like in Congress, we have the Senate and the House of Representatives. Same sort of idea in the UN. We have kind of like the Big Five. This is called the Security Council. So these are the Big Five powers: the US, the USSR, France, China, and Britain, and they are permanently elected. Today there will be 10 other nations within the Security Council, but at that time there's just, for the 5 permanent ones. And what they had is they had the power to veto. Okay, so if Russia doesn't like something, they can veto it. Okay, so this is kind of becoming more practical. The League of Nations was really ideological, but the UN is they're practical. Okay, so the Security Council has those Big Five countries, and they have the power to veto. And then the General Assembly is everybody. So those 5 big nations, the Big Five nations, whatever, those 5 nations plus everyone else. Okay, so that's kind of how the UN is set up. And the Senate overwhelmingly approves the UN Charter, permanent home in New York City. And it really does make some positive efforts after the war. For example, right, this is what the UN's up to after the war. Besides all of those charitable organizations we talked about before, or maybe we're talking about now, they helped keep peace in Iran. They helped to organize and create the Jewish state of Israel, meaning the country of Israel. And the charitable arm, which I was alluding to a second ago, they created the World Health Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So a lot of just charitable good stuff, promoting health, getting people food that need food, that sort of thing. But really its biggest failure is it did not do a good job regulating atomic energy, weapons, and research. The Soviet Union after World War II, left out of the atomic loop, so to speak, wanted the UN to completely outlaw atomic weapons, right? Because it would make sense, right? The UN doesn't have atomic weapons, or the UN. The Soviet Union doesn't have the atomic weapons, so in their mind, they don't want to be behind everyone. So like, well, let's just outlaw atomic weapons, why not? But the United States was like, no, we don't really want to get rid of our atomic weapons until we're sure that the world is stable enough, to get rid of them, that sort of thing. So really, the UN really threw away their chance to regulate or to tame the nuclear monster in its infancy. So the UN could have regulated atomic weapons, but they kind of let that slide. Okay, section K, the problem of Germany. Okay, so Nazi leaders had to be punished, and that's pretty much the only thing the Allied powers could agree on about Germany after the war. So we have something called the Nuremberg trials. This is when we're trying, I think, 22 of the top Nazi officials involved in all of these heinous crimes during World War II. So they're charged with crimes against war, breaking laws of war, crimes against humanity, breaking treaties, all of those things. Ultimately, 12 are sent to the gallows or are killed. Seven of those have long-term jail sentences. And trials of kind of the small fry Nazi criminals will go on for years. But the Nuremberg trials are really the head of the Nazi party, the ones who hadn't killed themselves at least. Okay. So the question is now that what do we do with Germany? We knew we didn't want them to be Nazis. There are some Americans who wanted to kind of de-industrialize them, kind of turn Germany into a potato patch, so to speak. Get rid of their industries. Germany, you have been in the center of 2 world wars now. We're going to kind of wipe you clean, get away any possibility of a 3rd World War. The Soviet Union, they are in their minds, they are not getting any financial help from the United States. They need money, so the Soviet Union wants to demand these huge war reparations from Germany. Give us all your money, you started this war, we need to recover, that sort of thing. But the United States wasn't very hot on that idea. We had tried that idea during World War I, it backfired on us. So the United States didn't want to put all these war reparations once again on Germany, that sort of thing. So a lot of different ideas floating around. And what they decided to do that, reality was that for Europe to recover, you had to have a healthy Germany. You had to have Germany's industry going. Germany was a part of Europe and, a key part of Europe and trade. So we had to get Germany back on its feet, so to speak. So what we did is we divided it, as we talked about in in Yalta. We divided it into 4 different military zones. Each different Allied power got a zone. And what eventually happened is Western Germany, which was kind of like the United States side, really became independent from Eastern Germany, which was the Soviet Union side. So we really see Germany kind of dividing in 2. The western part kind of going with the United States and Britain, and then the eastern part kind of falling under the shadow or behind the Iron Curtain, if you will, of the USSR. Okay, so the problem still was Berlin. Berlin was the capital, and Berlin, as it sat, Berlin was actually in the Russian side or the eastern side of Germany. But as a part of this deal, we decided that the capital was too important just to give to one power, so we actually divided Berlin, the city, into those 4 districts as well. Okay, so what happened is that the Soviets started to choke off all rail and highway access to Berlin, hoping to kind of starve off the Allies. So, USSR wants to kind of keep Berlin to itself. So because Berlin is kind of isolated within the eastern chunk of Germany, they start to cut off the roads to Allies or to the United States, so we couldn't supply our part of Berlin. So the United States not backing down, United States being America, after all, what Truman decides to do is something called the Berlin airlifts. Okay. Planes, right? So if we can't drive in the supplies, we'll fly in the supplies. So for almost a year, we were flying in tons and tons of supplies, food, troops, that sort of thing, into Berlin. So we were like, well, if you're going to cut off the roads, we're just going to fly it over. So after a year of this, the Soviet Union did kind of concede and open the roads once again. But, you can see both sides just kind of testing the limit, how far can you go? What if I cut this off? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Kind of just, kind of dancing a tit-a-tat there. All right, section L, the Cold War congeals. This is the last section, I believe, for this video. Praise the Lord. Okay, the Cold War congeals. Congeals, I'm sure like you've dissected something before. Congealed blood is kind of like the jellified blood. So like congels means kind of like settles in. That was not helpful. Anyway, So the Soviets are kind of testing the U.S. resolve. So one of these tests is the Iran oil reserves. So the United States and Britain had oil concessions in Iran. Like we mentioned before, we had a lot of control over the Middle Eastern oil. However, Russia had kind of set up camp in the northern part of Iran during World War II, and Russia was supposed to leave that area. However, instead of leaving that area, we actually get the Soviet Union supplying a group of rebels, and that's a problem, right? Because the United States wants to stay in Iran, Britain wants to stay in Iran. It's not very helpful if the Soviets are supplying a rebel group in Iran with weapons. So we kind of sternly sort of speak, give them a stinging protest saying, you should stop this, stop doing this, and they back down. So, I mean, we're still kind of testing the waters. What are you going to do? If I move here, what are you going to do? That sort of thing. Okay, so after this event, after this kind of weird thing going on in Iran, any good feeling, any camaraderie that was left, because after all, they were our allies in World War II, that was slowly but surely disappearing in the United States. And we really get this new policy starting in 1947 called containment, the containment doctrine. And what it says is that Russia, if left to its own devices, will continue to try to expand. It's going to continue to try to expand. It's going to try to go into Iran. It's going to try to go into there. It's going to try to go into there. So we have to contain it. We have to contain Russia so it won't stop, so it will stop expanding, that sort of thing. And really the first test of this get tough on Russia containment policy happens in the country of Greece and the country of Turkey. Okay, so Greece and Turkey were both democracies. However, things were really falling apart for Greece and Turkey after the war, and Britain had really tried their best to support the democracies in Greece and to support the democracies in Turkey, but Britain was running out of resources, and they're afraid that these two countries would fall into communist hands, which of course would be a win for the Soviet Union. Okay. So what Truman does is he establishes something called the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is his version of containment. And what it more or less said is that the United States would be willing to help any nation, any democracy that was fighting against communist influences. For example, Greece and Turkey. So what Truman does, he makes a very big deal out of this. He's saying, if Greece falls, then Turkey will fall. If Turkey will fall, the eastern part of the Mediterranean will fall, and kind of things will fall apart. So really making this into the issue, making this into a big, big deal. And so the Senate approves how much money? A bunch of money. Let me find it here. I don't know. They approve money. We give that money to help support Greece and Turkey so they do not fall into communist hands. And really even the clergy, Protestant clergy was getting involved with this. They called the United States the children of the light and the Soviet Union and communists the children of darkness. So this was definitely not just a political thing, but this was in the social realm as well. Okay. Also, kind of dangers at this time is after the war, France and Italy were still suffering, they're in ashes. Their economic systems are in chaos. So we're really scared that a communist party might take hold in Italy. We're scared a communist party might take a hold in France. So we really have to help kind of put the pieces back together in France and Italy before the communists can kind of creep in, so to speak. So what happens is we create something called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is named after the Secretary of State we have at the time, George C. Marshall. It was a joint plan for economic recovery. So let's recover together. And we said, if your country, would join in this group effort to kind of rebuild Europe together, the United States would give you a bunch of money. Okay. So we promised substantial financial assistance. So in July of 1947, a bunch of these countries meet together in Paris. And like we said, we'll give you aid if you make some political reforms, aka you're not communists. and also if you give certain amount of outside control. So if the United States has a little bit of control of your country, we'll give you some financial assistance. The Soviet Union, thinking this is just one more capitalist trick, walks out. So the Soviet Union refuses to participate. But over the next 4 years, 16 countries do agree to become a part of this Marshall Plan, and we give them about $12.5 billion. Okay. It figured if Uncle Sam, the United States, did not get the Europeans off of their feet or back onto their feet, they would never get off of our back. So the idea is, no, we don't really want to give them a bunch of money, but as soon as we can get Europe working again, the sooner we can forget about Europe already. Go back to focusing on the United States to some extent. The Marshall Plan is hugely successful. Within a few years, the European countries are exceeding their pre-war output. So it turns around fast. And also this section just kind of ends by mentioning Israel, right? So after World War II, kind of with just the heart of feeling so bad about the Holocaust of the Jews, the United States, meaning Truman, really pushes for or helps get passed through the UN the creation of Israel. Okay, so the problem was the Arab nations right next to Israel hate the fact that Israel exists. So because Truman really pushes for the creation of Israel, we officially recognize their government, this, that, the other thing, the U.S.-Arab relations will be, let's say, complicated for forever, more or less. But just so you know, this is when Israel becomes a country. All right, with that, we're done with this video.